Hey everyone, how's it going? I hope you're all doing great, as I always say. And in this video, I have a pretty crazy and scary story from Oregon. So, if that sounds like your cup of tea, then definitely pull up a stump with me and let's jump into it. Thank you for watching. Alright, I don't really trust therapists, and my dad won't talk to me about it. I would have gone on ignoring this too if the nightmares hadn't started up again. I need to get this off my chest and maybe find some closure. I'm going to try not to half-ass this, so let's go. I live in the high desert of Oregon. I won't go into any more specifics for obvious reasons. There were 3 people involved in this: myself, my dad, and a friend from soccer, Nick. I don't exactly have any pictures or video, as this was back when my phone was not so good and barely had a camera. It was mainly for texting and making calls, and I wasn't into photography, so I never had a camera. So I was 15, in the fall of 2012. At the time, I lived in a fairly rural part of town. I liked to be outside, and since I was homeschooled, my dad tried to get me into extracurricular sports. I make it onto a soccer team. It's not any official team, but it's something to do, and I don't sit around and gain weight, so my dad is happy. And on this soccer team I made a friend, who was a great forward. His name is Nick. I'm not going to bother changing it because Nick is such a common name, and I'm bad at making up new ones. And even in that little community, there's something like 80 people named Nick, so it doesn't really matter. So towards the cooler parts of the fall, we 3 decided to go camping. My dad's happy because it's a guy's trip, and that I have a friend. Nick is happy because he doesn't get to go that often, and I'm happy because I love the desert. I take my family's 2 dogs, both are German Shepherds, and we take stuff for a 2-day trip. My dad has 3 guns, 2 .22 pistols and a .22 rifle. The pistols are for emergency home/car defense. The rifle is for small game. They're not big guns by any means, and we've never really needed them, to be honest. So, we head out to the Badlands. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Pacific Northwest, or Oregon. It is mostly rainy, wet, green, mossy, lush, you name it. However, smack in the lower half of Oregon, there's the Badlands wilderness. The Badlands is intense, hot as hell during the day, cold as balls at night, and it never really changes season. It just gets colder or hotter. I won't get into the dangerous desert electrical storms either. It's full of brush, rock, and thousands of acres of endless sand, and short scrub trees, and dead wood. It's like a graveyard most times. Because of all the bones and stuff out there, I love it still, even after this, but it's a really, really harsh place to the unprepared. We have hikers die out there yearly, just from the weather. A decent amount of it is hiking trails, owned land, and all that stuff, but the vast, vast majority of it is an undeveloped wasteland. We camp in the wasteland. We drove out to a trailhead, walked in a few miles, and then weaved off. My dad and I have walked our dogs out here numerous times. We know where we are and where we're going, and there's more landmarks in the way of stones and stuff like that. The dogs are off their leashes, just doing dog things. Nick, my dad, and I are all talking, and generally just being dudes and talking about guy stuff. We make it a good 5 or 6 miles off the trail before dark. It's a bit dusky. There's a beautiful sunset, and all stuff like that you can see in the desert. We set up camp in between some rocks. I would have had pictures of this, but this was years and years ago, like I said. They've since been lost, and my phone was terrible at the time anyways. We had no fire because we were law-abiding citizens. We do have some cook stoves and stuff though, and we just put it outside the tent, roast some hot dogs and hamburgers and BS like that over the tiny flame. It's absurd but fun, and we're all enjoying it. And then the dogs start to get a bit weird as everything goes on. And these are not your couch potato dogs. One of them was a Schutzen competitor, Reed, a trained guard dog. The other was an adopted adult that was generally just a good boy. So we carry on with our enjoyment activities, and the dogs do eventually settle down. They do still appear to be somewhat on alert though. Periodic low growls and stuff like that, and just general whining. We figure that they're new to this particular area, or maybe there's a scavenger animal around. But the night passes without issue. We eat some breakfast at camp that we all pretend to love because, we're outdoors and stuff. My dad takes a nap. He keeps the 22 pistols, but gives Nick and I the rifle. I'm responsible enough to handle it, and Nick is not a total dumbass. Maybe we plink some rabbits or something, we think, but really we're just taking pot shots at dead trees and rock formations. We're squeezing off shots and playing around with the scope. Neither of us are a bad shot, and we're just out here exploring, being 15 and 16 years old, respectively. We have compasses and packs, and like I said, neither of us are dumbasses. And where we were was about a mile north of the broken rock formation where we all camped. This was across some flat nothingness. It's a small grove-esque cluster of rock chunks and dead trees, maybe a living juniper or two, nothing big, and it's not thick. It's more spread out than lush. There's enough of a cluster to be shady, and notably a bit of an oasis from the waste. Nick and I have no idea what's in there, if anything. Could just be some coyotes, some hardcore stuff for us teenagers. So we Rambo our asses up there, crouching like it's Skyrim, slowly creeping in. I've got the rifle drawn and a round chambered. It's the desert though, and we're still being loud enough that no small game would stick around for us anyways. It's quiet, and there's no animals in sight. As we get into the copse, the rock and tree cluster, it darkens up a bit and gives a really neat aesthetic to the whole deal. We stop creeping like dumbasses and stand up and check out the whole area. There's probably a solid 400 or 500 square feet of loosely collected rock spires, chunks and logs and dead trees, along with a few living ones. Some of the logs and branches had fell against a bent tree and some stone to make this little natural hut or thicket or whatever. There's a bunch of collected bones and some debris inside. Nothing artificial, but there's some stiff, long dead and dried animal hide scraps, and the sand is dark, just general appearances of being a den of sorts. Nick's interested, and I'm not too fazed, as this isn't my first time outdoors, nor in the Badlands. You get piles of animal bones pretty often if you're looking several miles out. Coyotes just gnaw at anything dead and leave them in piles. The den smells like a garbage heap, mixed in with something else, and just a general bad smell. After we can't take the smell anymore, we just leave that little area, but continue to inspect the grove, and from now on I'll just refer to it as the grove. There's this climbable tree. Technically most of them are, but this one's the most sturdy looking. The problem with Badlands trees is that they're incredibly fragile and breakable, given that even when they're alive, they're very dry. Finding one that I can get up in without snapping is difficult, as my height and weight are not compatible for these type of things. I prop myself up, about 12 feet or so, and I take a look with the scope and just get a general view of the land. It's pretty cool. I drop down and Nick's back to looking at the den. We should come back later and see if its owner is home, he said. Technically, even if its owner was home, it wouldn't have been legal to kill it unless it was Monty Python's Death Rabbit, as we didn't have any tags or licenses for coyote or otherwise. I still think it'd be cool to snag a look at something in its home. Nick's never seen this, and even though I'd seen and shot many coyotes, I had never seen one at its home. We agreed to do so, but with the dogs just in case. Coyotes are cowards, but this might be a group hideout, and we don't want to get nipped before we gun them down for self-defense if necessary. So we continue screwing around for the rest of the day. We go back to camp to find that my dad has walked the dogs and came back, and has the small cook stove fire going. The minute we walk into camp though, the dogs get very, very upset with us. They sniff us gingerly and then back away, growling, doing that leaning head tilt thing like they don't understand. They don't let us near them for a while. They always keep a few feet away and then return to being alert. We tell Dad what we found about a mile up, and he tells us about his walk. He agrees to come with us and bring the dogs, if only because he wants to see the area too. It's the evening again, but not quite dusk. I'm watching a rabbit just jump around and do rabbit stuff in the distance with the scope before I get bored, and I look around in the distance with it. It's beautiful. The dark stone, the brown sand contrasting with each other, the bleached gray trees, the purple sunset, the white thing. Wait, the what? I swing the scope back to the white thing, where it was previously perched, to my knowledge, on one of the stones in the distance. It's gone now, but I would have bet money on it. I didn't really see it too well the first time, on the rock, but it was crouched. It was either quadrupedal and standing, or bipedal and sitting, with its arms and hands on the ground. It wasn't especially big at first, but that may have just been the distance. It was bleached white, like bone. Not really much detail in the range I was in. I continue searching through the scope for the white thing again. Maybe it's a pale coyote or something else, but I don't catch a glimpse of it. Based on where I saw it, it was maybe directly or slightly off kilter to our west. I asked my dad if coyotes can be albino. I basically get a response of, yes, why wouldn't they be able to be? I shrug and I call it an albino coyote, and I forget about it. I fast forward through some idiot shenanigans and conversation to true dark. We're laying in the tents. The dogs are inside with us. Suddenly, the younger one goes berserk, a few seconds before the other one joins in too. They're making jerks between sides of the tent, which is relatively large to service 3 men and 2 dogs. We're just pacing around it, growling, barking. Their hackles are up and they look like monsters. I've never seen these dogs quite like this. It's full-on defense or offense posture. I genuinely thought they were going to attack us for a few seconds before I got awake enough. The smell of that garbage is back, though it's faint. Dad wakes up. Nick and I can smell it, but he doesn't seem to be bothered, and we don't mention it, and he doesn't either. He might have smelled it, but who knows? But I don't think he did at that point. He steps outside of the tent, and the dogs run out in front of him the very millisecond the door unzips. We begin pacing the length of the tent in our little camp area. Dad puts their leashes on and says, "Well, we may as well go now. Didn't get as much of a nap as I wanted, but it's about midnight." The dogs are still on Defend and Destroy, Red Alert 9000 or something, looking around erratically, constantly pulling against the leashes. Finally, my dad snaps at them to heel and shut up, and they do, albeit they're still growling lowly. The first thing we do when we step out into the desert is take a pee, as you do. So I grab the headlamps and 2 flashlights and we're all off. Dad's carrying the .22 pistol, Nick's holding the other one. Nick thought it was the coolest thing ever because his parents had never let him shoot a gun before, but he wasn't a dumbass and it was only a .22, so... And I have my hands on the rifle again. We head north. It's a pretty simple walk back to the Grove. The dogs are definitely not pleased by this venture. So about my dogs. Max was slightly smaller of the two, and a few years older. He wasn't as quick on the draw, ever, but he was still a very sturdy and reliable animal. He made you feel safe, but he was generally more high-strung. Beaver was the larger and younger of the two. Pretty laid back, but he was trained from puppyhood to be a god among animals. I'm about 5'9", and I was back then too. Nick was around 6 feet tall. We were both fit from soccer. Dad's about 5'11", and he didn't age the best, but he was still muscular. Everyone gets a potbelly eventually. Max seems the most irritated, constantly breaking focus to bark once or twice before hushing on his own. And Beaver is silent, minding the leash, but on the tetherhooks of aggravation. We get to the Grove, and the garbage/burnt smell is about 3 times as bad as when we were there the first time. The dogs straight up refuse to go in. Like, they actually refuse. They dig their heels in. Max begins growling and staring, before lurching back and forth, as if unsure if he wants to bum rush the Grove or stay put. Dad sighs and looks around. We can't leave them on their own, because it's the desert in the middle of the night, but Dad doesn't want us going in there alone. Oh, we can run in on our own and check. You're only a few 100 feet away anyways. And he says, okay, son, but don't be long. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to look for constellations. I'm not sure if this was the worst dad moment or the best dad moment, but he's my dad, so it counts for something. Those few 100 feet become very long when you're behind gnarled wood and rock formations in a shadowy black world, and you turn around and all you see is the lone light from the headlamp of Nick and I. However, emboldened by our guns and teenage idiocy, we pressed on towards the smell. Now this time, we really did make an effort to be quiet. We were almost crawling in the dark. Our lights are all off except for one flashlight, which he held, having only a one-handed gun. Behind the beginnings of the Grove, however, that teenage strength began to fail me just a little. The putrid smell, the eerie darkness, and the lack of Dad made me somewhat unnerved. By our low light, we estimated that we were maybe 20 feet away from the area of the den. We were correct. However, we had to creep around the front, having approached it from the back. As we cleared the backside of the den, and we were in the front, we heard a crack from nearby, as a very odd, white creature sprinted, almost too fast to notice in the low light, about 10 feet in front of us and into the den. If it wasn't for it being so pale, the light may not have even caught it, and we might have played the crack off as an owl or a bird, or have been unaware of the den having become occupied in front of our eyes. We did, however, both notice, and I kindly thank my dad for always preparing us with flashlights and other gear on these journeys. The thing was rather tall, and not especially broad as it was long. But then, at first, we only caught the side view in low light. We froze, and here comes the part that has haunted me for 2 years, almost every night, before it passed, and what has recently resurfaced. It all happened very quickly from here, so I won't exaggerate anything. Nick and I continued to get close, but this time, both of us had a round chambered, and we were pointing the guns at the den. We made our way until we were about 5 or 6 feet away from the entrance, and then flipped on our headlights. I don't know why we did that. I think our intent was to startle it and be able to see it, and then run. It was startled, very startled, and it let out a very disgusting screeching growl or a bark. It almost sounded canine, but very ugly sounding. It was also had a higher pitch in it, and sounded like there was spit and snot behind it. It was very apparent to us that this wasn't a coyote. We bounced back a few feet, and the creature didn't emerge. We could still see it, but it was moving inside the den in a bit of a frenzy. It made the scream growls a few more times, and Nick and I unanimously began to yell at each other, "Run!" That was probably the biggest mistake of the night, but thankfully, neither of us suffered for it. What we should have done was open fire the moment that we realized it wasn't a coyote. The second we turned and ran, I could hear sand and bone rattling and being tossed as it ran out after us. Nick managed to squeeze off a few random shots in the general direction, I think out of fear. I managed to get up into a tree about 5 or 6 feet in the air, and Nick wasn't far behind me. He was right there, but instead chose a rock formation about 10 feet away. He played forward after all, so his sprints were harder than mine, and I think he just wanted to run at the moment. The white creature pursued Nick, backing off whenever he turned, and then leaping along after he looked away. It was a dangerous game that only took a few seconds to play, but it unfolded in slow motion for me. Nick popped off the rest of the .22 clip, and then the white creature began to scale the rock. I wasted only a second before leveling the rifle and firing blindly. I could have hit Nick, but I'm so glad that I didn't. I did, however, scare the white thing, or I attracted it. It left Nick alone, and then did that weird scream thing at me, leaping off the rock. I began shimmying up the tree, and in the darkness, I cracked my head against a branch sticking out directly over me. The mongrel thing began to climb the tree below me. In a daze, my vision blurring a bit, I popped off another 2 or 3 shots. The clip of the rifle only has 6 rounds, and I kept that in mind. I figured that I only had 2 left, but I wasn't counting very well either, and I didn't want to be overconfident. Nick's yelling at something, maybe the white creature, but then I hear a different pitch of a scream. Nick just whipped the gun at the white creature and hit it. Not hard, but those things weigh a couple of pounds, and later on I realized why it hurt. Again, this whole sequence took maybe 30 seconds, but it felt so much longer. Then, as the thing is looking to climb again, I see it go flying off the tree trunk. Beaver, Max, and Dad came to the gunshots and yelling. My dad is several seconds behind. Beaver has just ripped the mongrel off the tree by slamming into it and grabbing it. I don't know how many of you are dog people, but German Shepherds have very boxy, broad chests and shoulders. If they leap at you and their teeth miss, they can still knock you flying a few feet if they intend to. In this moment, time seems to totally slow down. Even in the nightmares, this particular sequence plays out very, very slowly. Nick and Dad are yelling, Max and Beaver are snarling and yelping, and my conked-headed vision is starting to clear. The headlamp clearly illuminates this thing as it tries to deal with the dogs. It stands up. It's not quadrupedal, it's bipedal, and for 2 or 3 seconds, I got a very clear image that's been burned into my brain forever. When it stood up to its full height, it was tall, had to be 7 feet, and it was skinny as hell, and I mean scrawny. Long forearms, long hind legs, all of it kind of built like a dog. Somehow, even though it was so thin, I can't make out bones, but maybe that it was the flashlight and the white fur that's obscuring it. It was blisteringly white, stained now with red, either my dog's or its own blood. The neck is rather long and has a very long, pointed muzzle face with no discernible facial features. There's a gangly little tail and its eyes and nose appear to be black, but I could be wrong on the eyes in the circumstance. It had teeth, but I couldn't tell you what kind. The forearm or paws or hands or whatever had fairly long digits and had short claws on the end. I saw them, and more heard them make contact with the dogs. Overall, the thing most resembled a whippet or a greyhound in how skinny and long that it was, and in the face it was built like a canine as well, but it definitely stumbled around on two legs to get the advantage on the dogs. For many, many seconds, it wasn't just rearing, it was balanced like that. Its back and chest were appropriate for it. It looked natural to see it on two legs, basically. Again, I'm unsure if you're familiar with German Shepherds, but when they bite hard. They're the third or fourth hardest biting dog in the world, pound for pound. And if I remember correctly, when they bite down, they don't let go. Beaver, at least, had some great purchase on this thing's arm, and I heard a loud crack and the most horrific scream released. Max just snapping and ripping into whatever he could grab, I think. Dad didn't shoot. I don't think he wanted to hit the dogs. I didn't either, so I didn't waste any more shots. The dogs did good work, and I don't think this monster even wanted to fight, but we walked up on his house in the middle of nowhere. I hear a more normal yelp, and Max's head gets drizzled in blood. The ugly thing flails, and Beaver drops a few feet to the ground, as it had been swinging the dog a bit. It screamed again, and then sprinted on its hind legs, and I lost sight of it after it left the grove. This is where the nightmares ended, at least. Max's ear had a hole in it, towards the middle, and had likely been bitten. It bled a lot, but it was minor, and he's had worse. Beaver was pretty unscathed. Thankfully, overall, none of us were really hurt. Blood was all over the clearing, and in both dogs' mouths. I crept down from the tree, and Nick got off the rock spire. I landed on the .22 handgun, where it had been thrown, and knocked into the mongrel. I picked it up and shoved it in my pocket, and ran to my dad, too scared to cry. Nick was shell-shocked as well. The dogs gave pursuit, but my dad called them back. None of us said anything really. We walked back to the campsite. I don't remember ever putting the rifle down, and Dad still had a fully loaded gun. The dogs were still aggravated, but were quieter, as if they believed the fight was over. We all stayed awake, sitting outside the tent, my dad and I clutching the guns. Nick was just staring. Come dawn, we packed up and marched out, still not talking about it. When we got back into town, my dad looked at us in the back seat and said it was some kind of diseased animal and try not to worry about it. We nodded, not really knowing anything else to say. None of us believed it. It was a short encounter relatively, but we were all scared out of our minds because that tall-ass white thing was definitely not a coyote and not a diseased animal. Nick and I neglected to really keep in touch once soccer season ended, and by the end I had gotten a job, so I didn't sign up again to soccer. I tried to bring it up to Dad once, but he just shook his head and said stop thinking about it. We've never talked about it since. I've been out to the Badlands a few times since then because I still love it there, and my dad has too. Having once been a part of a search and rescue a few years ago, we've never seen anything else, and though we don't mention it, we make a point to never go anywhere within 10 miles of the grove. I would have loved to have never thought about this or talked about this ever again, and for a few years, I haven't. I am in my 20s now, and the last 2-ish years, it's mostly faded from memory. But in the past week, the nightmares are resurfacing, likely because of stress from other areas of my life, and I need to talk this out somewhere. So, here it is. That's pretty much my story. If anyone has had a similar experience with that white house spawn, it would be good to hear about it. And if you were concerned about my dogs, they're both perfectly fine. Beaver's a little older now and has chilled out even more, but he's still very healthy. Max's ear healed fine and you'd never know anything happened. He's past elderly now and is missing some of his front teeth, but both dogs and all of us made it out fine and relatively unscathed. So that story was pretty wild and scary, I think. What do you think? Do you have any of your own stories? I have an email in the description below where you can send them to. I also have links down there where you can support the channel. I have a PayPal and a Patreon if that's something you want to do. And with that, I think that I will see you in the next one. Thank you for always pulling up a stump, and thank you for watching. Oh, and as for the title thing, I do appreciate everybody that emailed and commented with ideas for titles. I'm going to use those or look over them or try to find something inspired by them whenever I have writer's block or whatever for a title. But generally, I was just kind of experimenting because there's been like a change to the YouTube algorithm. So I was just seeing like what kind of title sticks, what kind of one doesn't work, what kind of one does work, and just trying the wackiest one, the serious one, somewhere in between and stuff like that. That's just in case y'all thought that I was becoming unhinged or something, you know. Anyways, thank you all for the suggestions. They do actually help, and I'm glad to get them. But yeah, with all that, I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for always pulling up a stump, and thank you for watching.